Eleanor sat by her kitchen window, watching the last light of day fade behind the maple trees that framed her small Vermont street. The air was cool, sharp with the scent of pine and chimney smoke. Her house, once filled with laughter and footsteps, now felt too big, too quiet. Since her divorce 2 years ago, she had learned how to live alone, how to fill silence with soft music, how to eat dinner standing at the counter, how to pretend she didn't still check her phone hoping someone might call. Tonight, though, the quiet felt different, heavy, almost expectant. She poured herself a cup of tea, letting the steam brush against her face. The house creaked a little, like it was sighing with her. She looked around the framed pictures, the half-read books, the half-empty glass of wine from last night, all reminders of a life that felt paused. She used to love this time of day, when the sky turned amber and shadows stretched across the floor. Now it just made her think about all the dinners she used to cook for two, all the conversations that had filled this kitchen. Then her phone buzzed, startling her. The sound felt out of place, too sudden in the stillness. She reached for it, expecting a random notification, but stopped when she saw the name on the screen. Michael, her neighbor. The man she hadn't spoken to properly in months. Her pulse picked up. Michael lived just across the street, a quiet, kind man in his 40s, with eyes that always seemed to hold a story. They had once been close. Friends who shared coffee in the mornings, who helped each other with groceries, who laughed too easily together. But things had changed after that evening in the summer when an argument had left them both silent. It wasn't serious, just a small misunderstanding, yet it had carried something bigger beneath it, something they both avoided naming. Now, seeing his name again made her heart flutter with an emotion she didn't want to label. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen before she finally answered. "Hey, Elle," came his voice, soft and unsure. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "No," she said quickly. "Not at all." "What's going on?" He cleared his throat. There was a faint sound in the background, a sizzle, maybe a pot boiling. I made too much dinner tonight. I thought maybe you'd like to join me. It's nothing fancy, just some roasted chicken and vegetables. I figured it'd be better than eating alone." Eleanor smiled without meaning to. He sounded nervous, almost shy. It had been months since they'd spoken, but his voice still carried that same warmth that made everything sound honest. For a second she thought about saying no, about keeping her safe distance, about protecting the quiet walls she had built around herself. But the truth was, she was tired of being brave, tired of pretending that she didn't miss company, his company most of all. "That sounds nice," she said softly. "I'll be there in a minute." When she hung up, she caught her reflection in the window. Her hair was slightly messy, her sweater too big, but there was a small spark in her eyes she hadn't seen in a long time. She slipped on her coat, brushed her hair with her fingers, and stepped out into the cool evening. The world outside was hushed, the street washed in golden streetlight. The air carried the smell of rain, though the sky was still clear. Her boots crunched on the gravel path as she crossed the short distance between their homes. It wasn't far, just a few steps really, but something about it felt like crossing an invisible line. When she reached Michael's porch, she paused. Through the window, she could see the warm glow of his dining room. Candles flickered on the table, casting soft light over 2 plates already set. Her heart tightened. He had actually set a place for her. She knocked lightly. The door opened almost at once. Michael stood there, wiping his hands on a kitchen towel, his hair slightly tousled, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He looked surprised and relieved all at once. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she replied, her voice a little breathless from the cold. He stepped aside to let her in, and warmth wrapped around her instantly, the kind that came from both the oven and the feeling of being welcomed. The house smelled incredible. Rosemary, garlic, something sweet she couldn't quite place. "You weren't kidding about making too much," she said, looking at the spread on the table. He laughed lightly. "Yeah, I don't really know what happened. Guess I forgot how to cook for one." The words hung in the air for a moment, soft and honest. Eleanor nodded, understanding more than she wanted to admit. He guided her to the table, poured her a glass of wine, and sat across from her. The first few minutes were easy, polite talk, shared updates, small stories about neighbors and work. But beneath it all was something unspoken, something that flickered quietly between them, like the candle flames. Eleanor noticed the small details she had missed before, the way he listened, the way he leaned in slightly when she spoke, how his smile came slower now but seemed more genuine. She had always liked that about him, the calm steadiness that made her feel safe. After a few bites, she couldn't help but close her eyes for a second. "This is amazing," she said, smiling. "I haven't had a meal like this in ages." Michael chuckled softly, setting down his fork. "Me neither," he admitted. "It's strange, isn't it? You get used to doing everything alone, but you forget what it's like to share something simple like dinner." Eleanor looked at him, then really looked. There was a tiredness in his face, but also kindness, the kind that came from a heart that still cared even after being hurt. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was warm, alive, filled with all the things they couldn't yet say. Finally, Michael broke it with a quiet laugh. "I'm glad you came, Elle. I wasn't sure you'd pick up." "I almost didn't," she admitted, her voice gentle. "But I'm glad I did." Outside, the wind rustled the trees, carrying the first faint drops of rain. The sound was soothing, steady, like the evening itself was slowing down, urging them to stay in that small, golden moment a little longer. As she sat there, Eleanor realized how long it had been since she felt seen, not as a neighbor, not as someone's ex-wife, but as herself. The warmth of the room, the soft hum of conversation, quiet presence of someone who cared. It was everything she didn't know she had missed until now. When the clock ticked toward 8, she didn't want to leave. She didn't say it aloud, but she could feel it. Something inside her had shifted. Something gentle and real. And as she met Michael's eyes across the candlelight, she understood what the night truly meant. It wasn't just dinner. It was a small chance, maybe the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find again. Something that started with a simple call at dusk, and the courage to let someone in. When Eleanor stepped inside Michael's dining room, she felt warmth rush through her chest, not just from the heat of the oven, but from something deeper, something she hadn't felt in years. The soft light of 2 candles flickered between them, casting gentle shadows across the table. The smell of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the room. It was simple, but it felt like home, something she hadn't been able to create for herself in a long time. Michael moved quickly, between the kitchen and the table. His sleeves rolled up, a towel slung over his shoulder. "I might have gone overboard," he said with a grin, setting down a bowl of golden potatoes. "I didn't realize how much food do people actually need." Eleanor laughed, easing into her seat. "Well, I'm not complaining. It smells amazing." He poured her a glass of wine, just one. Then he hesitated, as if unsure whether to join her. She noticed it, that hesitation, that small pause that said he was still careful around her. But then he smiled, poured his own glass, and sat across from her. For a moment, they both stared at the food, neither moving their forks. The air felt thick but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that carried too many memories. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. "It feels strange, doesn't it? Sitting like this again." Michael nodded. "Yeah, feels like a piece of normal we both forgot how to have." They began to eat, and slowly the tension started to melt away. The food was delicious, warm, rich, comforting, the kind that filled not only the stomach, but the soul. Eleanor hadn't realized how empty her evenings had felt until that moment. Sitting across from someone who looked at her as if she mattered, she glanced around his home. It was cozy, simple furniture, a few books scattered on a side table, a half-finished puzzle on the counter. It looked lived in, but also lonely. She understood it instantly. 2 years ago, her house had looked just the same. "Do you still work late at the workshop?" she asked, breaking a piece of bread. He nodded. "Most nights. Keeps my mind busy." "From what?" He paused. "From thinking too much." She smiled faintly. "I get that." He looked at her then, really looked. "You've been okay, Elle?" The question hit her harder than she expected. People asked her that often, but not like this, not with genuine concern, not with eyes that searched for truth. "I'm trying," she said honestly. "Some days are good. Some aren't, but I guess that's just life after everything, right?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, after everything." The conversation drifted between light and heavy, laughter and small silences. They talked about the neighborhood, how Mrs. Avery down the street still left cookies on everyone's porch every Christmas, how the old maple near the mailbox finally fell last spring. They shared small memories, things they both remembered but hadn't talked about in years. And in between all those moments, something began to build. Not fast, not dramatic, but steady, like a tide returning to shore. At one point, Eleanor leaned back in her chair, laughing at something he said about burning pancakes on his first night alone. The sound of her own laughter surprised her. It had been so long since she had laughed that freely. Michael smiled, watching her quietly, his eyes soft. When she caught his gaze, she felt her cheeks warm. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said quickly. "It's just nice to see you smile again." She looked down, pretending to focus on her plate, but her heart fluttered. It was strange how easily he could still make her feel this way, even after months of distance. After dinner, he stood to clear the table, but she stopped him. "Let me help. You're the guest," he said with a grin. "Then let me earn my meal," she replied, already gathering the plates. In the kitchen, their movements fell into an easy rhythm, as if no time had passed at all. He washed, she dried. Every now and then their hands brushed, and each touch lingered a little longer than it needed to. It wasn't intentional, or maybe it was, but neither pulled away. When the dishes were done, Michael leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "You know, he said I used to cook for two all the time. It took me months to learn how to stop setting an extra plate." Eleanor looked up, understanding the ache behind his words. "Old habits," she said softly. "Yeah, but tonight, it felt right again." She didn't know what to say to that. The silence between them felt charged, almost fragile. She didn't want to break it, but she also couldn't stay quiet. "It felt right to me too," she whispered. He smiled then, the kind of smile that didn't just reach his lips, but softened everything about him. A moment later, thunder rumbled outside, low and distant. The first drops of rain began to tap gently against the window. "Looks like we're in for a storm," Michael said, glancing outside. Eleanor moved closer to the window, watching the droplets streak down the glass. The rain shimmered in the porch light, soft and steady. "I love the sound of rain," she said. "It makes the world slow down." He joined her by the window, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of his shoulder beside hers. "It's my favorite too," he said quietly. "You can't rush anything in the rain." For a moment, they stood in silence, watching the world blur behind the raindrops. The air felt alive, charged with something neither of them wanted to name. Eleanor turned slightly toward him. "You know," she said, "I almost didn't come tonight." He looked surprised. "Why not?" She gave a small, sad smile. "Because I've gotten too used to saying no. To people, to plans, to anything that might make me feel again. It's easier to stay safe that way." Michael's voice softened. "And now?" She hesitated. Then, quietly, "Now I'm glad I said yes." The words hung between them, simple but full. Michael's hand twitched slightly at his side, as if he wanted to reach for her but didn't dare. Instead, he nodded, his eyes warm. "Me too," he said. The rain kept falling, tapping gently against the roof, filling the pauses in their words. Time seemed to slow. The house no longer felt empty, it felt alive, breathing quietly around them. When Eleanor finally checked the clock, she was surprised at how late it was. The hours had slipped by unnoticed. She stood reluctantly, reaching for her coat. Michael walked her to the door. "Thank you for coming, Elle," he said, his tone soft but sincere. "Thank you for calling," she replied. As she stepped outside, the cool rain kissed her face. And she felt something inside her shift, not a grand change, but a quiet one. The kind that begins in the heart and grows slowly, like a seed after a long winter. Michael leaned against the doorframe, watching her go. "Same time next week," he asked lightly, half teasing, half hopeful. Eleanor turned, smiling under the soft glow of the porch light. "Maybe sooner," she said. Then she crossed the street, the sound of rain following her home. And for the first time in years, the night didn't feel lonely at all. The rain came steady that night, soft at first, then stronger, the kind that made the world outside blur into a watercolor of gray and gold. Eleanor sat on Michael's couch, her legs tucked beneath her, a warm mug of tea in her hands. The faint scent of cinnamon filled the room, mixing with the smell of rain drifting in through the open window. It was quiet, except for the low hum of the storm. Neither of them spoke at first. They didn't need to. After dinner, it had felt natural to move to the living room, as if the evening wanted to keep them together a little longer. Michael sat across from her, his elbows on his knees, staring into the small fire crackling in the fireplace. The glow painted his face in soft amber light. He looked thoughtful, almost lost in his own world. Eleanor watched him for a moment, realizing how different he seemed from the man she used to know. Older, maybe a little sadder, but somehow steadier too. There was a quiet strength about him that made her chest tighten. "You've changed," he said finally, breaking the silence. He glanced at her, surprised. "Good or bad?" "Just different," she said. "More calm." He smiled faintly. "Maybe that's what happens when you stop expecting life to be fair." Eleanor gave a small laugh. "I stopped expecting that years ago." The room grew quiet again. The kind of quiet that wasn't empty. It was full of everything they didn't know how to say. She sipped her tea slowly, watching the rain trail down the window. The light flickered, and for a second, the room dimmed. Michael looked up. "Storm's getting stronger." "Yeah," she said softly. "It sounds comforting." He nodded, then leaned back in his chair. "You always liked storms." She smiled. "You remembered?" "Course I did," he said. "You used to open your window every time it rained. You said it made you feel less alone." His memory caught her off guard. She hadn't realized he had noticed things like that. She looked at him, feeling something stirred deep in her chest. Not just nostalgia, but a kind of recognition. The kind that only comes when someone truly sees you. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly. "Miss what?" "The feeling that someone's waiting for you," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "At the end of the day, the comfort of knowing you're not coming home to silence." Michael's expression softened. He looked down at his hands, the firelight dancing over his skin. "Every day," he said simply. "I try not to think about it, but some nights when the house gets too quiet, I can't help it." Eleanor nodded. She understood exactly what he meant. The emptiness wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, like a weight pressing gently on your chest, reminding you of what's missing. "I used to fill the silence with music," she said, "or TV, or anything that could make me forget, but it never really worked." Michael looked at her. "What does work?" She smiled sadly. "Moments like this, I guess, talking, remembering that we're not the only ones trying to figure life out." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes meeting hers. "You ever think maybe we were both trying to forget the same thing?" Her breath caught. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The air between them grew heavy, not uncomfortable, but charged with emotion. The fire crackled softly. Outside, thunder rolled again, closer this time. The lights flickered once more and then steadied. Eleanor set her mug down on the table, her hands trembling slightly. She wasn't sure if it was from the cold or something else. "I didn't mean to stay this long," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael smiled faintly. "I'm not complaining." She looked at him, then really looked. The small lines at the corners of his eyes, the faint scruff on his jaw, the weariness and warmth in his expression. There was something deeply human about it all. Something real? He stood, walked to the fireplace, and added another log. Sparks rose, dancing in the air before fading into the chimney. When he turned back, she was still watching him. Their eyes met and held. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did we stop talking?" The question hit her like a wave. She looked down, searching for words. "I don't know." she said. Maybe because it was easier than facing what we were both feeling. And what was that? He asked softly. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She wanted to say loneliness or fear or maybe love, but all the words felt too heavy, too fragile. She shook her head. I don't know, she said again, though they both knew that wasn't true. He walked closer, sitting beside her on the couch. The distance between them was small now, just inches. The rain outside grew louder, as if urging them to speak before the moment passed. You don't have to be afraid to say it, he said gently. Not tonight. Eleanor turned to face him. The warmth from the fire brushed her skin, but it was his presence that made her heart race. I'm not afraid, she whispered. I just don't know what comes after saying it. He gave a small, tender smile. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. He reached out, taking her hand gently in his. Their fingers intertwined, not with urgency, but with quiet understanding. There was no rush, no grand confession, no need for words. Just a people sitting close, both healing in silence. The storm outside began to fade, the rain softening to a drizzle. The world felt still again, calm and forgiving. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, closing her eyes. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the weight of her loneliness pressing down on her. She felt safe, not because everything was fixed, but because, in that moment, she wasn't facing life alone. Michael rested his hand over hers, his thumb brushing gently against her skin. You know, he said quietly, sometimes silence says more than words ever could. She smiled. I think you're right. And as the last drops of rain tapped against the window, the fire glowing softly beside them. The house once filled with emptiness, now held something new. Not quite love yet, but something that could grow into it. The weight of silence had finally lifted, replaced by the quiet comfort of being understood. The rain had softened into a whisper by the time the night began to settle. The fire burned low, glowing like an old heartbeat in the quiet room. Eleanor stayed still, her head resting on Michael's shoulder, her hands still folded in his. She could hear his breathing, slow, steady, real. It was strange how something as ordinary as that could feel like peace. She hadn't realized until that moment how long it had been since she'd felt this, not romance, not drama, just warmth. Michael didn't move either. He seemed afraid that if he did, the moment might break. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking the time neither of them wanted to notice. The storm had passed, leaving behind the faint scent of rain and pine drifting through the open window. It felt like the world had been washed clean, ready to start again. Eleanor finally lifted her head, glancing toward the window. The rain stopped, she said softly. Yeah, he murmured, his voice rough from silence. It's quiet now. She looked at him, her lips curving slightly. It's a good kind of quiet. Michael smiled. Yeah, the kind that makes you not want to talk. Just stay. For a few seconds, their eyes met and held. The firelight reflected in his gaze, warm and steady. Eleanor felt her pulse rise. Not out of fear, but something tender, something hopeful. She wasn't sure what to say. And maybe that was the point. There was nothing that needed to be said. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. You know, he began, choosing his words carefully. I didn't invite you just because I made too much food. Ah! She tilted her head. No, he gave a small, honest smile. I could have saved the leftovers, but I didn't want to eat alone. I just missed having someone here. Missed the sound of another voice. He stopped himself, shaking his head lightly. I missed this. Eleanor's chest tightened, her heart tugged by the quiet sincerity in his tone. There was no charm in his words, no attempt to impress, just truth, simple and human. I missed this too, she said finally. I didn't realize how much until tonight. He looked at her again, a small flicker of surprise in his eyes. Then something softer, gratitude. Maybe I thought about calling you before, he admitted. A few times. But I didn't want to make things awkward. You didn't, she said. If anything, you made things better. They shared a smile, small and real, the kind that said everything words couldn't. After a while, Eleanor stood and walked to the window. Drops of water clung to the glass, glimmering under the porch light like tiny stars. The smell of wet earth filled the air. Behind her, she could feel Michael watching her, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that made her feel seen. She turned, leaning lightly against the windowsill. "It's strange," she said quietly. "We live just across the street, yet it feels like there's been an ocean between us." He nodded. "Sometimes distance isn't about miles." His words lingered, simple but true. Eleanor's eyes softened. "I think maybe that ocean's smaller now?" He smiled. "I hope so." The clock ticked again, and she realized it was late. The kind of late where silence grows deeper, where everything slows down. She sighed gently, her heart torn between staying and leaving. "I should probably go," she said. Michael nodded, but she could see the flicker of hesitation in his eyes. "Yeah," he said, "but you don't have to rush." She smiled, slipping her coat over her shoulders. "You always say that," he chuckled softly, "and you never listen." They walked to the door together. The house felt different now, lighter, somehow alive again. As they reached the porch, Eleanor stopped. The cool air brushed her face. She could hear the faint chirping of crickets starting up after the storm. Michael stood beside her, hands in his pockets. "Be careful walking home," he said. She looked across the street, the short path back to her house, lit by the yellow glow of the street lamp. "It's only a few steps." "Still?" he said, smiling. "I'll watch until you're inside." Something about that made her heart ache. Not in a sad way, but in the way that reminded her how rare care like that was. She turned to him, studying his face one last time under the soft porch light. He looked calm, but his eyes held that same quiet hunger she'd noticed earlier. Not for food, not for company, but for connection. "Michael," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Tonight meant a lot to me." He met her gaze, his voice low. "To me too. More than I can say." For a moment, they just stood there, the world around them still and silent. Two hearts that had spent too long learning how to be alone, finding comfort in each other's presence. Finally, Eleanor smiled, that slow, genuine smile he hadn't seen in years. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked playfully. Michael chuckled, the sound warm. "If you promise to bring dessert?" She laughed lightly. "If you promise to stay hungry?" He grinned. "Always." Eleanor stepped down from the porch, her boots crunching softly against the damp gravel. She turned halfway, giving him one last look. "Good night, Michael. Good night, Elle." He watched as she crossed the street, the light rain glinting in her hair, her figure glowing under the streetlight. When she reached her porch, she looked back just once and found him still there, exactly as he promised, waiting until she was safe inside when the door closed behind her. Michael stood for a while longer, staring at the quiet street, feeling something inside him shift, something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Hope inside her house. Eleanor leaned against the door, her eyes closing as she breathed in the familiar stillness. But it didn't feel the same anymore. The silence wasn't heavy tonight. It was soft, almost welcoming. She looked at the table where her half-finished book still lay and smiled. Somehow, the house didn't feel lonely. It felt expectant, like it knew she wouldn't be spending her evenings alone much longer. She made herself a cup of tea, just like she always did, but this time it felt different. Warmer. She sat by the window, glancing toward Michael's house across the street. The lights were still on. For a moment, she thought she saw his silhouette moving through the kitchen, and she smiled to herself. It wasn't love yet. Not the kind people write songs about, but it was something honest, something rare. The beginning of connection, of trust, of quiet understanding. And as she sipped her tea, she whispered softly to herself, "I've missed this." Cross the street. Michael turned off the lights and stood by his own window, looking out into the same rain-washed night. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long while, he was willing to find out. Two lonely hearts had finally found a little warmth. Not through grand gestures or perfect words, but through something far simpler: kindness, shared silence, and the courage to open a door when someone knocked. And though the night faded slowly into dawn, both of them knew something had changed forever. Sometimes all it takes is one meal, one storm, and one quiet evening to remind you what it means to let someone in again, for the first time in years. Both of them went to bed with a small, peaceful smile, knowing the hunger that brought them together wasn't just for food, but for the feeling of being seen, cared for, and remembered, not the kind of hunger only warmth can fill.